Hello everyone, my name is Tori, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be ranking all of the Brontë novels in order from least favorite to favorite. So many of you know I have been working on completing all of the Bronte's works this year, and I have officially done that, so my plan was always to rank them. I will say this ranking in particular likely will change, especially the top three, which we'll get to towards the end of the video because I'll start with the least favorite. I feel like with the Brontë novels, there's just a lot to think about, and the more I think about books, the more they mean to me, especially if there's a lot to them. And so really, even though I just said the top three, honestly, the rest of them probably will move around some as well, depending on my time in life, my experience. All of them I do intend to reread in the future. So there was none I would despised necessarily, but there were some that maybe I just didn't like as much. Let's get into this video because if my previous ranking videos are anything to go by, I take a lot of time with them. So let's start with the bottom, my least favorite of the Brontë novels, and that is Shirley by Charlotte Brontë. Now this one, I gave it 2 stars when I read it, and I didn't despise it. It was more just kind of boring to me. Like, I really didn't love the plot. I didn't really feel super engaged in it. There were portions that I really actually felt moved by. This book made me feel emotional at certain parts, but there were just large enough chunks of time where I was really bored that it made this book really difficult to get to, and it actually led me into a reading slump. And now that I'm experiencing this slump right now, maybe it's just the time of year, but I genuinely struggled with this book. I do think in the future I may enjoy it more. I guess I should really quick explain what it's about. So this story follows Caroline and Shirley, and they're best friends. They become best friends once Shirley moves into this area, but they quickly realize that maybe they both have an interest in the same man, and that causes some problems. That's a very basic synopsis of the story. There are other subplots and things going on, but I think the biggest problem with this is it's not a very tight plot, and that's something I found with Charlotte Brontë, is that a lot of her books besides Jane Eyre have kind of loose plots. Like, it feels like she's trying to discuss and analyze too many aspects of life and doesn't create a very cohesive plot in order to do that. And so it just feels very disjointed, and I feel like this was a case where that happened a lot more even than in her other books, in my opinion. So it was disjointed. I didn't really feel super engaged in it. I felt like Shirley was a horrible friend, and I felt like we were supposed to like her, but I just didn't really like her very much. I felt like she was just very unaware of what was going on around her and of her friends' feelings, and if she was aware, that she didn't care, and it really bothered me. So anyway, it was interesting. It had interesting aspects, and again, I'm willing to reread this in the future, but for now it is at the bottom of my Brontë ranking. Next we have the last book by the Brontes that I read, and that is The Professor. Now this is one that I enjoyed a lot about, and honestly this one and my third to last choice, the next one, are pretty interchangeable. I could probably switch them up depending on my mood, but mostly this one, I just really did not like the main character, and that made it a struggle to read. So this story follows a young man who is basically trying to figure out what he wants to do in life. He doesn't have a very caring or helpful family, and so he's kind of left to his own devices, which I think he kind of wanted, even though he complains about it. But anyway, and eventually he ends up in Brussels as a professor and finds an interest in both a nearby headmistress and a student. And so that's a little, especially from a 21st century perspective, that's a little iffy, the fact that he starts up this relationship with one of his students. Very uncomfortable and unethical. But you know, it was a different time, so I was willing to forgive it. Plus, it sounds like Charlotte Brontë had an interest in one of her own professors, and so I think it was kind of like a fantasy situation with this. But yeah, the professor, the main character, was just very unkind. He's not very respectful of women. He just was not a very nice person and very judgmental and self-righteous, and it got a little irksome. I will say the person he ends up with has a lot of self-righteous in her. I think it's a little more subtle, but I think they make a decent match. I honestly think she's probably too good for him, and I'm surprised that she would allow herself to be interested in him. I actually kind of liked her as a character. Again, I think she has some level of self-righteousness, but I have a little bit more respect for her than I do for the main character, and maybe that would have changed if we were in her head, which I'll address a little bit more in my next book that I'll mention. I could also tell that this was Charlotte Bronte's earliest work, as the writing was not as great as it is in her later works. One thing I did appreciate about this is the more direct discussion of physical and sexual attraction as well as intellectual attraction. I just felt like it was a little more open than other Victorian novels tend to be, especially by women, and I found it interesting to read about. I will say, having read the Bronte biography, that it's very intriguing to me that Charlotte Bronte really wanted this published in her life, and her publishers just kept saying no, 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 and she just kept pushing, wanting to rewrite this over and over and trying to get it so that they will publish it, and then they published it after her death just to make money, basically. But I can't help but wonder why she was so insistent that this book be published and why she was so proud of it. But I can't help but think, going back to my comment on her relationship or attraction, I guess, to her professor, that maybe this was sort of like a, I don't know, some sort of validation for her about those feelings that she felt bad about. I don't really know for sure. Obviously, I don't know her. She's long gone. So anyway, this book is in the second to last spot on my ranking. Up next we have Villette, also by Charlotte Bronte, and this one is basically like a more drawn out version of The Professor, but from the woman's perspective, which is why I mentioned earlier that maybe if I had been in the woman's head in The Professor, I would have liked her less, because I feel like in this I don't love Lucy Snow very much. I do find her very interesting. I don't despise her as much as some people I think do, but she is very judgmental. She's not very likable at all. This one also has a problem of having a really meandering plot, similar to Shirley. There's just a lot going on, and I feel like Charlotte Bronte wanted to discuss so many things in this book that she didn't narrow it down very well. I feel like The Professor definitely has a much tighter plot, which I appreciate about that one, but I will say the character development in this is much better drawn. I feel like the side plots are better fulfilled. I feel like in The Professor there are a couple side plots that don't really develop very much, and you're not really able to get much closure on those. I feel like this one though does a better job of exploring those subplots, exploring the characters as it should, as it is a lot longer than The Professor. I actually do like the relationship that ends up occurring in this book, no spoilers, but I know a lot of people don't. But to me, I don't like either of them, but I think they complement each other well. I think what makes them each dislikable and also what makes each of these people interesting really makes them work well as a couple. So I feel like as far as a balanced relationship, this represents a good one. The ending, I'm still not totally sure how I feel about it. Part of me hates it, but part of me can kind of appreciate it and be okay with it. I just don't really know. I do find that the writing in this though shows a lot of growth in Charlotte Bronte and her skills. Definitely you can see the progress between The Professor and this, but this is one that I also can understand people DNFing, people hating, because it's just a sort of strange story, frankly. There's not a lot to love. I feel like I was engaged in this story, I was engaged in the romance aspects, but it just didn't come together the way I would have liked it to. That would have really spurred me on to love it. So it's just a little bit disappointing for me. I had hoped for more, especially because I know some people who absolutely love this book. I'm just not one of them, unfortunately, but I do enjoy it, I think, better than Shirley and The Professor. Although these three definitely could switch around on rereads. We'll just have to see as I grow older how my perspective changes. Now getting into the top four, and while those first three I don't hate them, but I don't love them either. These top four, I love all of them. I will say in this fourth spot, this is the only one that I feel pretty strongly will stay in the fourth spot. It could potentially change, but at this point I think it probably will forever be in the 4th spot on this list, but it's still a 5 out of 5 star read. I absolutely love it. And frankly, if it's not a favorite book of all time, it's definitely close to being a favorite of all time, and that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. If you're keeping track, all 4 of Charlotte Bronte's novels are at the bottom of my list, or the bottom 4 on my list. So definitely Charlotte Brontë is not my favorite of the Brontë sisters as a writer or as a person, but we're not going to get into that right now. But I do love Jane Eyre. This is a wonderful story following Jane Eyre as she grows up as an orphan, ends up in really unfortunate circumstances. Her aunt and cousins who are involved in raising her really abuse her, and then they end up sending her to boarding school where she is also not very well treated. However, she is able to make some connections and really build herself up as a person, and as she gets older she eventually becomes a governess for the mysterious Mr. Rochester, who is hiding a secret, and the rest goes on from there. What really makes this book for me is probably Jane herself. She's a very strong-minded character. She's very relatable, I think, in a lot of ways. Despite all the abuse and everything she's suffered, she's still definitely traumatized by that, but she has much more self-confidence and self-respect than I think people in that situation usually do. And I really think that shows her integrity. It doesn't show that she isn't affected by the abuse. You can definitely see she's been affected by it, but she's risen above that, and it's just so inspiring to read about. And you also see her not only grow in her understanding of herself, but in her understanding of the world, and she's willing to learn, and she does develop as a character. Even though she starts off really strong, we are still able to see her learn and grow over time with her relationship with Mr. Rochester and things going on in the house. And she's just a very intelligent, wise, interesting, strong person, and I absolutely love reading from her perspective. I also love the atmosphere in this book, all the gothic atmosphere that is involved. It just creates such a wonderful reading experience. Mr. Rochester, while I wouldn't date him myself necessarily, does have a lot of charming and interesting qualities about him, and he's an interesting character to think about because despite the fact that he does a lot of bad things, basically, he shows himself to be very complicated and pitiable in a lot of ways. You kind of come to understand where he's coming from, and even though it doesn't excuse his actions, you're able to understand a little bit more. Something I find about the Brontes that I absolutely love is, despite their living at a time when psychology was just barely beginning, if even really a thing at all, they clearly have a very strong understanding of human psychology that wouldn't be expected back then. Not to say that they're completely right in their interpretation of human psychology, but I think you do see some level of exploration of that in all of their books that is done in a really interesting way, and I definitely think that's explored very well in this. I really, really love this story. Definitely one I hope to come back to many times in the future. Okay, getting into my top 3, and as I said before, these 3 likely will change over time as I reread them, but for now, they're my top 3. That's all you really need to know. I'm putting them in this order for now because it feels the most right at this moment, but again, it could change. It probably will change, but all 3 of these are definitely favorite books of all time, not just favorite Brontë books, but favorite books of all time. So starting off with The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë in the 3rd place. I love this book. This story follows a man by the name of Gilbert Markham, who ends up meeting Helen Graham, who is this woman who comes to stay in this nearby house, and the people in the community start to spread rumors about her, but he doesn't really believe them, and it's kind of about him finding out about her background. And then the middle portion of the story is actually from her perspective as Gilbert reads her journals regarding her past and what has happened to her and what brought her to this house in the first place. It's a really powerful look at abuse and alcoholism and the position of women, and not only does it explore these topics so well, it also has incredibly wonderfully drawn characters that you just fall in love with. Helen Graham is one of my favorite characters ever. She just has such quiet strength and great integrity. She doesn't care what other people think about her really. I mean, you know, like anybody, it bothers her a bit when people think wrongly of her, but she knows what she's doing is right. She knows she's doing her best, and it's just so incredible to see her basically standing above society and saying that she knows what's best for her life and for her child specifically, that her life and her child's life are her business, nobody else's. The plot of this story is very easy to get engaged in. Some people I have heard say that it's a bit repetitive and drawn out, and I can understand where they're coming from, but I think that's what abuse is like. It's the same things happening all the time, and it just starts to drive you insane more than it already did because it's horrible treatment that you're receiving, and so I think that's explored so well, and I appreciate that Anne was willing to write this book knowing it probably wouldn't be well received, because she had experienced some level of this sort of treatment from her brother, and so she's sharing her own experiences through this book on some level. Of course, she's creating this whole other story. I think she's probably exaggerating or building upon some of the things she had experienced, but it's really touching, and it's very brave of her to have written this book, and it's a good story. I think it's easy to get wrapped up when talking about this book in the topics it's addressing because it really is so groundbreaking for the time, but I also love the story itself. I love the characters themselves. I find them so interesting. And again, I really love Helen as a character and see so much integrity in her. So anyway, I love this book so much. I'm so excited to reread it. This and Anne Bronte's other work are two that I really, really want to reread sometime soon. I think it's been the longest since I've read those two books, so definitely need to get to both of them. And in second place, we have Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Now, this book was originally in the third place when I was thinking about this video, but I reread it for Victober and I realized I just absolutely love this story. I talked about with Tenant of Wildfell the exploration of abuse, and I think that is done even better in this book, particularly the idea of the cycle of abuse and how that can continue down generations. I feel like is very interestingly explored in this. As I mentioned earlier, the Brontes did a great job of really exploring human psychology, especially when it comes to trauma and abuse, exceptionally well. This book follows two families living in the Yorkshire moors, and one of these families ends up adopting this young boy named Heathcliff, and things continue on from there. Like I said, it deals with the cycle of abuse, with revenge. There's obsession and alcoholism and psychological manipulation and ghosts and just so many things that are explored in this book that are part of this story. And it's beautiful and wonderful to read. It's so engaging, it's so easy to fall into. All the characters in this book are just awful to each other. There are very few that really inspire any sort of like in me, but there are a few, such as Hareton. I really feel so much pity for him. I feel like of all the people in this book, he's the most a victim. Yes, he does things that are unkind, but in general, like, even those things aren't really his fault because he doesn't know any better. He doesn't understand how he's been treated and that it's wrong. And he's just such a fascinating and pitiable character. I absolutely adore him, frankly, and pretty much everybody else in this I hate. But that's part of the charm of this story, frankly, is that all these people are so dislikable in a lot of ways, but you also understand and kind of pity them to some level. You are able to see that they've all been mistreated and it's led them to do things maybe they would otherwise not do. I guess another character I do like for the most part is Isabella, actually. She turns out to be a very strong character where she starts out seeming very flat and flimsy as a character, but she really shows herself to have a lot of strength, and her fate is very unfortunate, I would say. But anyway, off that side tangent, this is just a beautiful story and the writing is incredible. The world is just comes to life. This is the only Brontë novel I have read 3 times, and honestly one of the only books I've read more than twice, and it's just so freaking good. I absolutely love it. will be revisiting it many times throughout my life, and I would not be surprised if this actually turns out to be my favorite Brontë novel. I'm not gonna say that yet because my favorite, that I'll mention in a second, is still really high up there, and I've actually considered it to be in my top 5 favorite books of all time for a long time, so I'm like not ready to kick it off that pedestal yet. But if I reread it, I may find that this is my favorite Brontë novel, but for right now I'm going to put it in the number 2 spot. And number 1, many of you may have guessed what it is if you've been paying attention to what books I've already mentioned, but that is Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. I love this story so much. We follow Agnes Grey, who becomes a governess, and we basically just follow her experiences as a governess, and she has a little romance that develops. This book is just charming. It's wonderful to really, I think, get into the head a little bit more of Anne Brontë. That's something I love about Anne's works, is she's willing to share her own experiences in such a raw way while also combining it with fiction. And I think Charlotte Brontë and Emily do that to some extent as well, but there's just something about the way Anne does it that's so simplistic and yet so beautiful that I just love. I think Agnes Grey is a really interesting character, and frankly Agnes Grey as a character is the one I relate to the most in all of the Bronte's work. I know a lot of people relate to Jane Eyre, and I do on some level as well, but I think the thing about Agnes as a character is that she's secure in herself, but she also has more of an awareness and care for others than I feel like Jane Eyre sometimes has. Like, I feel like there's a little bit in Jane Eyre of observing other people without really feeling any affection for them. I don't always see her really loving people. There's very few people in that book that I feel like she has much care for, and I feel like in this, while Agnes can also be self-righteous in her own way, I feel like she genuinely wants to help people and is open to doing what she can, even for people who, like some of her students who are spoiled brats. She has some level of wanting better for them, and I just appreciate that about her. I also think Agnes just has a quiet personality overall, yet has a lot of integrity, similar to Jane Eyre. And again, like I mentioned with Jane Eyre, I just really love reading about that. I also feel like the male love interest in this is like the only Brontë male love interest that I would be okay with dating myself. And really, I just love the slice of life aspect to this story. I think there's just a lot of charm to it. I think Anne Brontë has a way of bringing beauty to the simplest things in life. I think there's other authors who try to write things like this that are very simple, sweet stories that may be fun, but they just don't bring the same level of beauty to those slice of life stories, and I think Anne Brontë just does that so well. And I really, really want to reread this because like I said, I've considered it for a while one of my top 5 favorite books of all time. I just love it so much. It's such a beautiful story, and yeah, I really need to reread it because it's great. And if you haven't read it yet, definitely give it a try. I will say it doesn't surprise me that it's not everybody's favorite. I think it works for a certain type of personality, and that just happens to be my personality, so it works for me. But I think most people will at least enjoy the story and find it's worth the read. So that is it. That is my ranking of the Brontë novels. Let me know down below your thoughts on my ranking. If you have a different ranking, I would love to know what your favorite and least favorite Brontë novels are specifically. And yeah, just share your thoughts on anything Brontë. I would love to hear. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!